Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fiscal Focus at DawnNews English. I am Danish Khan, and today we're going to critically analyze structural impediments to economic development in the context of the global south. To discuss this, I'm joined by Ingrid Kvangraven. Ingrid is Associate Professor of International Development at King's College London. She is also a founding editor of the blog Developing Economics, and she has her own podcast called Hierarchies of Development. Thank you, Ingrid, for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I want to start by asking you, how is the term development usually conceptualized in economics and international development, and what's your take on it?
So development usually in the mainstream of the discipline is conceptualized as capitalist development, and it's always implicitly Eurocentric view of capitalist development. So this is where capitalism is seen as this rational system developing smoothly and endogenously to help improve productivity, increase formal employment, reduce poverty, all these great things. And any problems with this transition or this development, as they would call it, would tend to be attributed to institutions that don't properly support capitalist development or individuals not behaving rationally enough. So therefore, in that context, a lot of development interventions end up being about nudging individuals to behave more rationally, or improving institutions, right? Improving good governance, etc. So this is it's based on a Eurocentric view of capitalist development, but this is something that is very rarely actually acknowledged, right, by the economists themselves. They would rather say that they're looking at allocation of resources or institutions or governance, but implicitly there is this framework underlying it. And my take would be quite critical towards that. So this Eurocentric view overlooks the fact that capitalism is actually itself highly uneven. It's exploitative. It hides the fact that the development of capitalism was supported by a lot of global factors like colonialism, transatlantic slave trade. It was not a smooth transition in England, as is often assumed. It was actually highly violent. And as such, it doesn't recognize that actually capitalist development continues to be global, highly uneven. And this actually makes it impossible for countries in the global south to develop into this kind of high-tech, full employment capitalist utopia that is very often kind of implicitly assumed. So in this context, it actually becomes impossible to have catch up and for all countries to be equally developed. So papers over colonial legacies, how they shaped and continue to shape capitalism, and also kind of papers over all inequalities, all kind of structural drivers of inequalities that shape the capitalist system, like patriarchy, racialization, imperialism.
I mean, that's a brilliant answer because as we both went through like PhD training in an economics, and yeah, in a traditional economic courses, we never get to read this stuff, right? But we are fortunate in some ways that we went to schools which were more pluralistic and had that alternative or heterodox perspective. Now, keeping that historical view in mind, in the contemporary world capitalist system, can you specify some key structural impediments in the way of development for countries of the global south? And I know your work is focused more in Africa. So, yeah, can you talk a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, with this history in mind, thinking about how capitalism developed unevenly, the way that production was shaped was also highly uneven, where historically, most innovation and technological development happened in the global north, and the global south countries were kind of colonized in order to be exporters of raw materials to countries in the global north. And we see that these structures, to a large extent, have continued. So we still have countries across the global south exporting primary commodities. Many have also transitioned to exporting manufacturing goods, but always kind of very low value added goods, or very often very low value added goods. The way that global value chains are structured tends to be seeped in kind of the power hierarchies of the world. So there's like these big corporations that control the global value chains that make it very difficult for countries in the global south to industrialize. So that's an important structural impediment. Should I go on?
Uh, um, no, I agree. These are the major issues. And recently, I checked. You wrote a paper called "The Hierarchies of Global Finance," right? And we know the international finance and these international financial institutions are very play a critical role in the development processes of the countries of the global south. So, how do you see their role in this hierarchy of international development?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in that paper, so it's a paper that I wrote with Maria Divekestive, a co-author of mine, and we argue that the global financial system, which is governed by these international financial institutions that you mentioned, essentially more or less serves to reinforce the existing hierarchies that I just mentioned. It makes it cheap for rich people, especially those in the global north, to borrow, expensive for people living in poverty, and especially people in the global south. It puts countries in the global south at a disadvantage in terms of being able to um, um, finance production or finance development at stable and affordable terms. Financial systems have also reinforced other kinds of hierarchies, like racial hierarchies. African countries forced to pay premiums on finance. And even like within South Africa, as we show in the paper, access to finance has been highly racialized. And this is also something that I know a lot of people have worked on in the context of the US as well. So basically, one of the things that we argue in the paper is that in order to understand how this works, we need to move away from this sort of assumption that finance is something that's rational and progressive and good, and that can be a tool that's neutral, and rather understand how it is a tool that's seeped in power. The international financial institutions, I think that was part of your question, of course, are dominated by countries in the global north, as we know, in terms of the decision making. So they often then also reinforce the system where they put countries in the global south in a position where they can't do the things that they want to do. They really limit their policy space.
Yeah. I mean, this is a good segue into the next topic that I have in mind, and that is the dependency theory, right? I read about dependency theory in the graduate school at Amherst, but I was so pleased to see that you have been reintroducing it in the discipline, and you wrote multiple papers on dependency theory. So tell our audience, because it's maybe not everyone is aware of, what is dependency theory and what are their core arguments?
Great. I mean, that's great that you read dependency theory at UMass. That's very rare. That's kind of, even in some heterodox places, you wouldn't read dependency theory. I actually didn't read it at the new school, but I was very interested in it, and I ended up writing part of my dissertation on it. I was trying to figure out what it was. That was the starting point, because there is a lot of confusion regarding what it is. And actually, there's a lot of debate regarding what it is, because there's different strands within dependency theory. There's Marxists, there's structuralists, there's institutionalists, and they all disagree with each other, which makes it even harder. So part of my PhD thesis was kind of trying to analyze and understand what are the core elements of the different theories, or what do they all have in common. That's a strength that we could try to understand and preserve. And what I came up with then was that it's always a global and historical approach to understanding capitalism, global capitalism. It focuses on the theorizing of unevenness, of polarizing tendencies of capitalism, focuses on the structures or the social relations of production and how they differ across the globe, and also the specificities of the countries in the global south, the specific constraints that they face. So this leads to a very different way of conceptualizing the development of capitalism than what I was mentioning at the beginning, this kind of Eurocentric view. The expectation from the dependency theorists would be unevenness. It would be polarization, both within and between countries, which led them to question the possibilities of this even capitalist development everywhere.
Right, and it originated primarily in the context of Latin America, but
Yeah.
now do you think it's relevant across the global south, or there are some caveats here?
I think so. I mean, if we conceive of it as I just defined it, that it's about understanding how capitalism developed and the unevenness that it produced, and kind of thinking about the specificities. I think it's super important in order to understand the continued concentration of innovation and technology in the global north, continued poverty, widespread unemployment in the global south, how finance works to reinforce these issues, the difficulties of like the lack of convergence. Yeah.
So, in terms of the major structural factors in the realm of dependency, what would be that? So, you mentioned international finance. Is trade another way of perpetuating that dependency and inequality, or there are some other factors too?
I think production is important in terms of how production is structured, and that also is reflected in trade. I mentioned finance. There's a lot of different, like different scholars in dependency theory kind of focus on different things. Some other aspects that they would point to would be like currency hierarchies.
Right.
Countries in the global south face more volatility and higher costs in the currencies. Recurring trade deficits because of having to import manufactured goods and exporting raw materials that have falling terms of trade is important. And this often also is connected with recurring debt crises. And it just in general, how inequality is produced and reproduced. Like with global value chains, or even if we can think about the not so recent anymore, but lack of COVID vaccines to the global south when that was an issue.
Yeah. And I remember that one of the conceptual, like two conceptual categories in dependency theory are like core countries and the peripheral, and then maybe somewhere in between semi-peripheral. So there's a divergence within the global south, right? I'm teaching a course on development, and we've been talking about this divergence debate. So within the global south, do you see like how can we explain divergence within the dependency framework? For instance, can we conceptualize all of the global south as a periphery, or there is some distinction between?
Yeah, great question. So I think some dependency theories probably did see these categories as quite static, but I think most of them would say that it's not necessarily about saying, oh, there's two categories of countries that are the same, but rather thinking about like what are the kinds of constraints that are associated with peripherality. Is what Andrew Fisher kind of talks about this term, instead of just thinking, okay, it's the periphery, but is there something about peripherality? And then thinking about, some of the things that I mentioned already, like currency hierarchy or whatever, they would be different for different countries, right? So it's not like they would all be the same. There's a hierarchy within the South as well. And I think on that note, that it's also important to mention that it's not like, I think dependency theorists weren't trying to just understand the kind of center periphery dynamics, but most of them actually were looking at specific, how things were playing out in a specific country, right? And they were always arguing that this like unevenness is reproduced internally as well. It's not just like a center periphery issue. You have like highly uneven production structures also within, and that's actually one of the key characteristics of a periphery as well, that you would have like a very small, more industrialized sector, and then like a larger, less industrialized sector, and there's this unevenness. So I think that can be an important tool or like framework to try to think about differences within the different countries. Of course, different countries in the global south have huge, like vastly different histories. So you can't really compare, like, I don't know, China, India, and Malawi and Guatemala. They would have very different challenges. But in terms of thinking, like, you would be able to explain the different situations by thinking about things like the history of capitalism, the specific constraints, and how production evolved from a dependency perspective.
Right.
Actually, one of the things that I had a hard time writing my PhD thesis in a way, because I had a critic of dependency theory on my committee. So a lot of my work ended up being about like trying to think about think very carefully about how to counter some of the common kind of stereotypes of dependency theory. And the paper that came out of that project eventually is called Beyond the Stereotype. And then actually, because one of the common criticisms is like, oh, but what about South Korea, for example?
Yes.
They actually moved from periphery to center. So that dependency theory is wrong.
Yes.
So in that paper, I unpack how you could understand South Korea from a dependency theory perspective to try to explain that it's not like a deterministic thing. It's not a theory that's saying, oh, everything like is impossible to develop, but it's saying there are these specific constraints that you need to consider in order to understand how things can evolve.
Yes, and especially the argument of unequal exchange that has been used to argue that dependency theory is less relevant today because the global trade, the dimensions have changed as production has been relocated from countries of the global north to the south. But now we're also seeing another shift. Now they're trying to bring it back to countries of the global north, especially in the case of the United States, where I am based. Now, from the policy perspective, what are the unique insights that dependency theory offers that, for instance, folks who don't study dependency theory would generally miss out? I mean, you already mentioned some, but are there specific policy insights here?
It's a good question because in a way, it would you could. It kind of, if you take dependency theory to its logical conclusion, you end up kind of questioning the whole capitalist system itself. So that's the kind of difficult, it's not easy to kind of translate it into policy. But if you're a policy maker and what you want is just to understand what you could do within the constraints of where you are in a global South country or in a global North country, I guess what a dependency theory way of thinking would lead you to consider is kind of the power dynamics, right? And so not just see development as some kind of technical thing, but it's a battle that needs to be, if you understand that it's a battle and it's a power battle, then, that could be helpful in terms of thinking about, okay, you want to challenge the IMF. Probably you're not going to be able to challenge them just based on your arguments because this is a power issue. So there need to think more strategically about how to change things. Generally, probably it'd be easier from that perspective if you coordinated with other countries to try to put forward some kind of alternative. I think that's the kind of direction the dependency theory perspective would lead you to, rather than it doesn't lead to kind of easy policy fixes or like, oh, you just need to control your deficit in this way or that way. Like it would take you away from those kinds of questions.
Yeah. Generally, in the realm of policy making, policymakers tend to think in very technocratic terms, like just solving a utility function, right? In terms of economics. But as you rightly mentioned, international development is way more complex and sophisticated, and power imbalance and hierarchies are entrenched in it. And you are also one of the founding members of the group called Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics. Now, tell us about this project. Like, what do you mean by diversifying and decolonizing economics as a discipline?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. So this network started went back when I was a PhD student. Well, the seeds of it started back when I was a PhD student at the New School, and we were actually scholars, some at UMass, Amherst, and others at SOAS in the UK, and somewhere in India and other places, Zimbabwe. And we got together and we all felt the same issues with the economics discipline, also with some heterodox economics, not just in the mainstream. That it felt very exclusionary, like it was racist, it was sexist, and it was also it excluded a lot of more radical thinking from the global south, like, for example, dependency theory. So that's kind of this dissatisfaction and frustration with the discipline is what led sort of many of us to come together to create this organization. So it was launched in 2019, and some of the goals of the field are about shifting the way economics is understood, the way it's taught, who's read, who's who's read in teaching materials and whose voice gets heard. It's really again about, I mean, we're all academics and PhD students basically trying to make a change, but we also at the same time recognize, and we like mentioned this in the mission statement as well, that this is actually a big project of like challenging the power of the economics discipline and the mainstream specifically, or like especially because of how Eurocentric it is. So as I mentioned before, how they understand capitalism as a very kind of rational, neutral thing. So we're trying to challenge the idea that any social science can ever be neutral, that there's always an ideology behind, and then trying to push for more radical ways of doing economics. There's also a project that I'm working on with 3 co-authors, and we actually just submitted the manuscript this week for a book on decolonizing economics. And that's with Devika Dutt, Caroline Alves, and Serbi Kazar. And it's called Decolonizing Economics: An Introduction. Right. And basically in that book, we argue that economics is thoroughly Eurocentric. It was born Eurocentric. And this is very visible in the sort of implicit assumptions that they make about capitalism. And we argue that a decolonization framework could be one that centers an understanding of structural forms of power. And there's a lot of different theoretical frameworks that do this, where I already talked about dependency theory, but there's of course more as well that are alternative. They're not just alternatives from the South, but they're also better ways of understanding the world. But then a part of the problem is that, and we also have faced this problem in Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, is that from our view, or our understanding is that mainstream of the field rose to prominence precisely because it legitimizes a certain way of thinking about economics and the way that the economy is structured. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, decolonizing economics can't be just about challenging the knowledge or like the ideas, but also challenging actually the power structures that have led those ideas to become prominent, which is a much bigger and more difficult project. But yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the term heterodox economics, and so how do you conceptualize it? What is heterodox economics in your perspective, and how this decolonial and diversifying economics projects add to that tradition, if you think it's part of that heterodox economics tradition?
Yeah, great question. And of course, we both come from sort of heterodox backgrounds. And again, what heterodox economics means is something that has been like thoroughly debated in the literature. We see it as something like the kinds of studies of the economy that take structural power relations seriously. So that's different from, in the mainstream, they look at power, but whenever they look at power, it's always market power. But in the heterodoxy, there's like structural power, look at class, very often class. Also patriarchy, racialization sometimes, imperialism sometimes. So we argue that heterodox economics, whereas the mainstream probably cannot actually decolonize because it's not possible for that framework to incorporate structural power. Heterodox economics has a lot more potential to do that because, fundamentally, heterodox economists care about power, they study structural power, and they also are much more aware of how economics is not a neutral field, but that there is an ideology underpinning it. Because heterodox economists have been excluded from the mainstream, of course, this is a much more prominent, and there's a higher consciousness about it. So I think the thing is that heterodox economists can still end up doing quite Eurocentric work sometimes, especially when it's focused on the global north. So in the book, we say, we are all heterodox economists, and we think that heterodox economics can be a way to push for a better economics. But there are also issues that we in the heterodox community have to deal with in terms of being quite global north centric. And historically, I think heterodox economics has tended to not focus as much on questions like racialization, imperialism, dependency. So there's still some work to do within the heterodoxy, but it's a sort of a more conducive environment for a decolonization agenda.
Right. I mean, I'm looking forward to this book project. It looks very interesting, and I'm sure it's going to add value to the whole debate in economics. Thank you so much, Ingrid, for your time. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus at DawnNews.